Hi, this is Paul, and all of you know these other two fellas. And I asked them for a conversation because around the topic of the advent of the sacred, because this is a phrase that John has been using, and both we're reaching the season of Advent in the Christian calendar, and obviously the word sacred is a common word. And I haven't seen Jordan's book yet, but he's obviously been talking about it for better than a year already. And for Jordan, his the sacred is a very important piece of Jordan's meaning, sort of political creation that came out of the Exodus seminar. These two individuals participated in the gospel seminar, which I am also looking forward to. And so I wanted to have a conversation about the advent of the sacred, especially because, well, again, Advent is this season where we think about the first and second coming of Jesus in the Christian calendar. And the sacred is something that is very much tied to altars, blood sacrifice. I mean, that's sort of the history of the word that comes up through the church. Roman Catholic churches, of course, have crucifixes in the front. Protestant churches often have substitutionary atonement, which very much ties what Jesus did on the cross to Old Testament sacrifice. But yet I see this word sacred sort of passed around. Elizabeth Oldfield, of course, has a podcast called The Sacred. And when she opens the podcast, she asks people what is sacred to them. And to me, it's interesting how, okay, what on earth do we mean by that word? And what on earth do we mean by the advent of the sacred? And so my idea was for this was I'd sort of lay the table as I have now, giving just a little bit of the understanding of when I hear these words, what I hear. But I very much wanted to give John a chance to sort of flesh this out. And I was very interested in what Jonathan would think of this, because obviously I mean, Protestants are technically sort of protesting Catholics. The Orthodox, the one thing I learned in seminary about the Orthodox, there's probably only one thing in 3 years, which was that Orthodoxy tends to emphasize incarnation, which is obviously very deeply tied to Advent. And so I thought this would be a great thing to hear from both of these guys on what on earth are we talking about when we're talking about the advent of the sacred, especially in line with all sorts of other changes that we see happening culturally, where the world is not getting less religious, but more religious. And I think in many ways, our understanding of what we mean by the word religious also continues to evolve. So maybe I'll first give the ball to John because he's the one who picked this phrase. And so I'm curious to hear what he thinks of it. And then I really want to hear about from Jonathan. So
Okay, well, I mean a lot by it, and so I'll have to talk for a bit, if that's okay for both of you, and a little bit about how I got into it. I got into it in the dawning realization, another criticism that people, so you two have made a lot of good criticisms of Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, but you also have been very supportive. Jonathan wrote a wonderful blurb for the book, so I know it's critique and not just criticism, and I appreciate that. And you know the presentation of Awakening from the Meaning Crisis was very individualistic, and that's why the book is not. Awakening from the Meaning Crisis is deliberately dialogical. It is written in dialogue with Chris, and so responded that way. You know, all of the dialogical practices have emerged as a response, and they are our most popular practices, by the way, on the Awaken to Meaning platform. The dialogical practices, by far and away. So something important was there. So thank you for that. I mean, that's hit a nerve in the good sense of the word, in a deep way there. So there's that. But there was another one that I've come to realize. You made about a bunch of other ones, scalability and stuff like that. But and I keep responding to those as I take seriously what both of you have to say, and I aspire to be as a good listener who responds to good critique. Another one that's come out, and both of you, I mean, and you've often done it affectionately, but when I was talking about the religion that's not a religion, and then the critique became very clear to me, both from things Chris was saying to me, my own growing intuition, and then my beloved friend Bishop Maximus, when I was at the monastery in Etna, he took me aside and said, "John, stop talking about the religion that's not a religion. You're just alienating everybody, and even though you don't want to, you're setting yourself up as something, and this is all just wrong." And then he said, "I really like the philosophical Silk Road idea. Use that." That's what I pivoted to. And I think the part of the critique was this, that although I think some of the ideas I was talking about is important, and we can maybe come back to that, the framework was really, and the orientation was wrong. It was very much an enlightenment, I mean the European Enlightenment framework of I'm going to engineer a solution in this purely, formal manner, design a religion. And then it occurred to me, given my growing experience in all of my practices, especially the dialogical practices, when dialogos happens and the conversation takes on a life of its own and people are feeling deeply called from within to being deeply called without, in a way that everybody gets beyond where they could get on their own. It, the central feature of that spirit, of that Geist, is it takes on a life of its own, right? It advents in a really important way. And I'll come back to that in a minute. And then I realized, oh, I can't make this. That is just fundamentally the wrong attitude. And instead, what I have to understand is I have to understand that the sacred is something that comes and takes on a life of its own and shapes people and transform them in ways they could not have foreseen, but for which they are grateful. And that was a fundamental pivot. So it's another criticism of Awakened to Meaning that I've taken to heart and I've tried to respond to. And I've tried to respond to it both theoretically, a reconceptualization, and existentially. And so what I mean by Advent is you're getting already at one sense of it. I mean an orientation to the making space, Eckhart's images of making the manger so that the Son of God can be born again in you. Making space, but not just empty space. It's an affording space so that the sacred can come into the world and take shape as it wants to do. I'm sorry, I don't mean to use anthropomorphic language. I know neither one of you would care, but right. And so that is definitely what I'm emphasizing. It's a fundamental way of reorienting, reapprehending, reappreciating the sacred and reappropriating what our relationship to it should be, our religio to it should be. And so what I mean more by the Advent is I think the meaning crisis has got two aspects to it. Paul, I talked to you about this, the symptomology with Chris, all the negative signs that are breaking frame and breaking institutions, and we see that just continuing and unrolling. And Paul, you've been doing a lot of work about that and with the withdrawal of modernity. But there's a lot of frame making. We have all these spontaneous communities, and Rafe, Paul, you've got to meet Rafe now, and you know about his community. You know what a fundamentally good faith guy Rafe is and what he represents. He's an exemplar, but I meet lots of these people in lots of these communities. And that's happening all around the world, like Thomas Staudinger in Germany, for example. So I think that's one of the main cultural things, that frame breaking and the beginnings of frame making, which speaks of an Advent. It speaks like something like an insight, but on the level of the world, not on the level of an individual. And then what's happening, and this is part of what's going on in my book, when I came into the cognitive science of religion, I said, I'm not going to give you a definition of religion. I can't, because the very word we use and the concept we have is all within the Enlightenment framework. And the Enlightenment framework is built of all these disastrous dichotomies, right? The fact value distinction, is ought, theory data, right? Mind body, mind world, self other, religion, science. That whole fable that religion and science have been in nothing but conflict has been destroyed by excellent, excellent historical work. The relationship is much more complicated and much more one of mutual affordance and mutual transformation. And all of them, the fact, like, if you want to, I can get into it, but, where is relevance a fact or a value? Well, relevance points to that there aren't any facts without relevance, and there are no relevance that aren't correctable by the facts. All right. And the startling thing to do is just ask people, what do you mean by a fact? And they go, you all worry about value and subjective and how could it possibly be real? And you just take it that you know what a fact is. Well, Putnam destroys that. Quine destroys the analytics. And so these are not like, people on the beach in LA, right? This is the guts of rigorous analytic philosophy. And so what I said to them is, I'm going to run through, right, and the demarcation problem in science, right, which is a central problem. There's no clean way of deciding where science leaves off and non-science begins. You just like all of this. And I said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do like Wittgenstein does. I'm going to take apart, I'm going to deconstruct and dissolve a picture. And then how does reality and religio now disclose itself to you? And what might you be called to say about religion from that? That's what I'm doing. And that is the advent of the sacred. There's the breakdown of the monolithic mind, that the mind is monological. It talks to itself and it just uses logic. Monophasic, one state of consciousness is the only one that gives us access to reality. We don't have to undergo transformation to get truth. We just need a universal calculus, as Leibniz said, and we can just calculate everything, right? So that's collapsing, and we're recovering the other kinds of knowing, and more people are talking about this. We have the advent of 4e cog sci, which I don't have to go over again, I hope, about how that's really making all kinds of topics associated with religion, spirituality, and the sacred scientifically legitimate again. We have the fact that overlaps with a renaissance that's happening in biology. Biology is the science driving a scientific renaissance happening right now. It is the science that is feeding back ideas into the other sciences and fundamentally altering our sense of who and what we are. Now compare that to what's happening, the decline of physics. The Nobel Prize was not given to a physicist. It was given to a cognitive scientist. That tells you something. And you got all the people talking about there's been no significant theoretical advance in physics at quantum level for 50 years, and no significant advance in relativity for over a century. And so notice that contrast where the living things are now coming to be the paragon through which we understand reality, science, rather than the merely physical things. That's happening right now. And so I think all of those, and I see this when I'm talking to academics, this sense that all of this different stuff is starting to coalesce and give birth. And what I'm expecting to happen, and what I hope to afford to happen with the philosophical Silk Road, is to get all these three things, this sort of cultural frame breaking, frame making, all this academic work, and all these emerging communities into a deeper dialogue with each other. Because I think that will afford the advent of the sacred. It'll afford a way, a place in which it can take on a life of its own. What do I mean further by the advent of the sacred? I mean the re-beautification, the re-glorification of what we take the sacred to be, and we move it fundamentally from something that we assert to something we appreciate. And I think that is part of what I mean by the advent of the sacred. By the sacred, I mean the triple transcendence that the atheist but Canadian philosopher, yay, Schellenberg talks about. I mean, and talking about this a bit also in the Cognitive Science of Ritual course eventually, Jonathan. So the sacred is that which is most real, gives us ontonormativity, the really real. It is that which is most reorienting or orienting for us. It gives us our North Star, and it's that which is most transformative of us. It can bring about the comprehensive transformations that constitute things like rebirth, enlightenment, metanoia, moksha, etc. And so what I think is happening, our final thing is this. I think an ecology of traditions is taking shape, creating a lingua franca, lingua philosophica that is analogous to the ecology of practices that individuals and groups participate in. So there are many books, and believe me, I'm reading them all right now for the Philosophical Silk Road. But one, for example, written by a Christian, by Bracken, called The Divine Matrix, which is something like the travelogue for the Philosophical Silk Road. Saying he looks deeply into like the pagan Neoplatonism and then Aristotle and then Christian Neoplatonism, and then he looks into Taoism and Buddhism. He left out Vedanta, which I think is a bit of a mistake. But he said, and he's not doing some weak, oh, we should all love each other. He's saying that right there is a lingua philosophica running through all of this.
Mhm.
And right, rather than it challenging anybody being homed, it can actually rehome them more profoundly, but it also can help people to travel where they need to go. And um, and I think that points to what Paul talked about. I mean, we still get, there's a video I just saw the other day about, the death of God and the growth of secularization, but that's not what the research is showing. The research is showing is that this is becoming a much more spiritual, I'm going to use that useless term, time for us. And I think what that means is the people's hunger for coming into religio, a meaning in life enhancing connectedness to what is most real and transformative and orienting, that hunger is growing. And what's at issue is people need, and again, this doesn't mean that they have to leave the religion they grew up in. But many of them need a rebirth of it in some way. I'll use Bishop Maximus's term for what Christianity did to Neoplatonism. They need a transfiguration, a rebeautification, a reglorification, in order for them to return or to journey and find. And I think all of that also bespeaks to the advent of the sacred. Sorry, that was a bit of a thing, but I was trying to give a comprehensive and as concise of an answer as I possibly could. Finally, for me, my relationship to this is not intellectual or even philosophical. My relationship to this is existential, spiritual, religious. I feel called a profound responsibility to, well, undertake the pilgrimage on the Philosophical Silk Road, to do my best to be responsive and responsible to the advent of the sacred. So that is where I'm at existentially.
Thank you. Well, that's very much what I was looking for, and you did it well. So thank you, John.
Thank you.
Jonathan, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
There's a lot. I mean, obviously, there's a lot in what John said. I think, I mean, I kind of like the idea of the advent of the sacred. I like the term. I think it's a good term. I think that clearly there's something happening. I mean, it's been happening for a while. I mean, obviously, I tend to think it's been happening since 2016, but I think that there's something shaking. Everything is kind of shaking and moving. Uh, what's his name? The New York Times guy, Ross Douthat. How do you pronounce his name?
Doubt yeah.
Douthat. He finally, I was like, if Ross Douthat, who is the New York Times normie, like kind of starts to see something, I think it's actually happening, right? Because he's all of a sudden talking about Reenchantment. He's like, oh, there are all these books out there, Spencer Clayman's book and David Bentley Hart's book on, what is it? All Things Are Full of Gods. And then Rod Dreher's new book, it's like everybody is all of a sudden talking about this. I mean, it's been preparing itself for a very long time, I think, but now the normies are starting to notice. And so I think that, and it's in conjunction in some ways with some of the discussion that Jordan started having right at the outset with Sam Harris, right? Because the idea of the sacred, I'm pretty technical about what it means, in the sense that I like the very technical description, which means that it is something that is set aside in some ways, or that's something that is dedicated. Maybe that's the right way to use that word, the idea of dedication. Um, even in French, I don't know in English how much you use it, but in French, for example, we use the word consecrate. We say something
Yeah.
is consecrated, but we use it in all at all sauces. Like we can say, this is like this fork is consecrated to this type of food, right?
Mhm.
We actually use the word consecrated in the sense of dedicated, like this is dedicated to that. Um, and so and because I tend to think fractally, that's how I see it. I see that what we're seeing in CogSci, in the discourse in general, is a rediscovery of the hierarchy of participation, how things
Yep.
are dedicated. Like that's how that exact all things in some ways are dedicated, even at the smallest, most minute level, for you to even notice them. In some ways, you're inserting them in a hierarchy of purposes, all the time as you're functioning. And so there's already this sense of the sacred in that way, which is that in some ways what you realize is that the sacred or the dedicatedness of things is the precondition for perception. It's the precondition for engagement in the world,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
that it scales. And so, I would say it's funny because a long time ago, maybe not that long ago, if someone would have asked me, like, what does the sacred mean to you? I would have just rolled my eyes at a question like that, and I would have been very annoyed because I'm like, but now I can see how it can fit, because in some ways there is a reality to the sacred, which is local, very local. Like it's local in every step that we make. And then it scales in our participations. And so there's an aspect of the sacred to our families. There's an aspect of the sacred to our communities. There's an aspect of the sacred, like I said, to the fact that I have a place where I put my books, right? It's a sacred aspect. It's like I have this little sacred space for books. That's a library. Um, and the question that I ask, and this is the one I guess my life's work is about, or is where does that go? How does it all come together, right? You know, without denying the sacredness of all these little participations that we have, are there forms of the sacred that bind it together, right?
Mhm.
In the
Mhm.
religion sense, is there something that kind of binds it together? And that's what interests me the most, especially as we look at these large scale issues of even nations, or how is it that we bind? How are we consecrated? What are we given to? Like, what are we dedicated to? um yeah, so those are the big questions that I ask, and I think that in that way the advent of the sacred is a gray thing. It's not necessarily just something that is, or maybe it's shimmering, but it's not necessarily something that is going to be good, because it can also, the sacred can inebriate, right? It can
Right.
also
Right.
cause types of ecstasy that are unreasonable. People obsession, right? People who become obsessed, people who put the wrong thing as their dedicated, direction, and then become uh, kind of drunk by that. So I'm worried about the advent of the sacred in the sense of extreme nationalisms, or the advent of the sacred in let's say kind of rainbow identitarian stuff, because all that stuff is is very
Mhm.
sacred, right? It's these weird identitarian things where people give themselves and glorify things that they put, like the pride flag is interesting. Like, would you have thought, like, let's say 40 years ago, that you would have something like a pride flag, because a flag is a sacred object, right? It's something that you raise up, that you fold. I remember when I was young, they would say you can't let the flag touch the ground. Like there was this whole
Yeah.
ceremonial aspect of it. But then that you would have now these flags that are untouchable and are sacred, but are not related to the things we usually think of, that they're related to diversity and let's say difference and strangeness and all this stuff. Anyway, so just to say that I think that, like, I like the idea of advent of the sacred in the sense that it's happening to us. It's something that everybody is kind of seeing come over the hill. It's like almost a revelation. Um, and that there'll be I mean, I think we're going to see a fight. We're going to see a war of the gods. That's what we're going to see. We're already seeing it's already happening, but I think it's going to become clearer in the next few years. And again, the question is, how do we bring it together? How do we and I think that the philosophical Silk Road thing is interesting because the question is, even in terms of the global problem, which is that if I see, and I do see that, I think Christianity offers the most, offers the best vision, and the best vision of the sacred, and the idea of self-sacrifice, and the notion of love. The things that we put at the top, the cross, for example, is something that disarms the dangerous, or in theory disarms the dangerous aspects of the sacred that the sacred can sometimes have. But I also understand that we are living in a world with all kinds of other visions and all other kinds of possibilities. And so I also embrace the philosophical Silk Road approach, which is that we also need ways to talk to each other, and we need ways to find the things that we have in common, and then recognize honestly the things that we don't have in common, and have ways to engage and talk about it and exchange and debate without fighting, because the other option is fighting.
So, Paul, maybe I could respond to Jonathan, and
Yeah,
then you could.
absolutely.
First of all, Jonathan, thank you for that. That's exactly right. I mean, I will enter. I have entered into good faith. We just did it with you and Jordan Hall and I. About Christianity. That is how, and I hope you hear this the right way. I want to do that with all of the traditions and all of the sages that I interact with on the philosophical Silk Road. I want them to challenge me so that I can hear what I have not heard and see what I have not seen. I think that's very important that people now understand that. And I think the lingua philosophica is, and with the possibility of mutually transformative dialogos between traditions, is, I think, the alternative to the war of the gods. I feel very strongly about that. So I think we're convergent on that. This idea about dedication, I was going to say, yes, that is the Latin origin. And I think, this is so bound up with relevance realization.
Yeah, for sure.
And the religio and meaning in life and belonging and connectedness. But what's happening also because of the 4E cog sci, because of the collapse of all those disastrous economies, because of what's happening in biology, we're getting back a leveled ontology. And I've been talking a lot about this in the public space too. We're getting back a leveled ontology, emergence all the way up, emanation all the way down. And I mean, like, read Eric Hol's book, The World Behind the World. Look at the work of Michael Levin in biology. These are people making rigorous technical arguments, bringing in, really challenging, interesting empirical evidence. That's where this is at. So first of all, and this is why I think, and I've been making a case for this publicly, talking about 4E Neoplatonism, I think, is a respectable thing to do right now, in a really important way. So I think that whole idea of, of that which, right, we orient to, and it fitting into a leveled ontology of participation, I'm in complete agreement with that. I think that's part of what I mean by the advent of the sacred. The fact that we're giving up you loved all the anti-reductionist arguments I'm doing in the course. And by the way, I talked about the flag in the course too. Right. And yes.
The course on the symbolic world.
This is the cog sci. Yeah, we would plug our course. It's the cog sci ritual. It's great. John has given a few of them, and I've been following them. They're amazing, and they're very helpful I think, for anyone who cares about religious questions or cares about how to orient yourself. They're great. So, anyways, continue, John. Sorry.
No, and thank you for that. And I hope to exemplify what I'm talking about. What you said, this allows a deep dialogos between science and religion that has been prohibited since the Enlightenment. And the course is an attempt, the cognitive science of ritual is an attempt to exemplify what I'm talking about, as much as talk about it. I share your concern. I share your concerns about, about people rabbit holing, and doing confirmation porn, and doing symbolic bypassing and all of the proclivities around the sacred that human beings have historically done. I think you're bang on that that is a serious issue. My hope, and it's a hope I'm trying to make more probable, is by more tightly binding the advent of the sacred to scientific knowledge and to the cultivation of wisdom, we could help to address and ameliorate that very significant threat. That is also part of the project. That is part of the philosophical Silk Road. The lingua philosophica is exactly that, right? That one of its primary mandates is to do exactly what you say, afford dialogos, but also challenge. I want to say this spiritual bullshit in a profound way. And help people to cut through it both individually and collectively. And so I think very, very much that's the case. And so my hope is that the advent of the sacred will draw people into good faith challenge of themselves and each other, and a responsiveness to those challenges. I'm really concerned the way you are. I'm not trying. I'm trying to tell you I'm taking it very seriously. And part of what I'm trying to do in the project is to address and give people, the conceptual vocabulary, the theoretical grammar, the historical exemplars, ecologies of practices, mythos, cross-cultural mythos, cross-historical mythos, so that people can avoid this. I think some of it is inevitable, because like you said, it's already on fire. But my hope is that hope hasn't gone out of the world in the religious sense, and that we can properly educate it in the Platonic sense and respond. So I take very seriously what you say. I share that concern. That's why I'm doing so much right now. I'm doing the course on your platform. I'm doing Einstein and Spinoza's God. Is it getting away? This is an interesting way to get people to talk about ultimate reality and God, because they normally won't. But when they hear about Einstein, we're like, oh, what's that? And Spinoza, oh, wow, right? And that opens people up.
So, as a pastor, I deal with people who, if I say the word sacred, I watch what they do and I listen to what they think. And John, I really liked, I think the Advent was very clear, what you brought here. And I think we're continuing to see progress on Advent rather than manufactured. People are very uninterested in going to a factory, but they are curiously drawn to a holy place. And I liked your triple transcendent, most real, most orienting, most transformative. I think that's really helpful. When I think about phenomenologically, when people think about sacred, it very much is. So again, sacred sort of comes from the Latin, but if you drill down in the Old Testament, you get holy. Holy, of course, is set apart. Right away, when I listened to Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris debating, that's where I got my God number one and God number two, because holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory. This is what the seraphim cry in Isaiah 6 when, to the shock of everyone, God shows up at his house. And the seraphim are there, and that's what they cry. And so you very much get holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, apart, sacred, away. The whole earth is full of his glory. Now, when I listen to Jordan talk about the sacred, one of Jordan's latest themes has been communities are created by sacrifice. And, especially having learned a lot from Jonathan and having learned a lot of history, when you, for example, I just preached on Elijah, that text. And during the reign of Ahab, it's so good, John, that you were raised as a Christian, because we can talk about these Bible verses and you know them, which is.
I talked a lot about Ahab when I was talking about my course on the literature of the meaning crisis, because I was talking about Moby Dick.
Oh.
Wrong
Well, the other
Ahab.
Ahab.
Wrong Ahab.
So
but that other Ahab is
Yeah, there's a
all
connection.
about the Ahab from the Bible, all
Yep.
about that.
Yep. So you get this fun little verse where Jericho is rebuilt, and the foundations are at the cost of his eldest son, and the gates are at the cost of his youngest son. And of course, on one hand, people hear that and they think like spooky things, but spooky isn't actually a bad word. One of the things that echoes in my mind from Lewis's Till We Have Faces, which of course is a myth retold, is one of the litanies in that story is dark places are holy places. And I was just pulling. Holy places are dark places. It is life and strength, not knowledge and words that we get in them. Holy wisdom is not clear and thin like water, but thick and dark like blood. Why should the accursed not be both the best and the worst? And so part of what I see in the popular discourse with respect to a new excitement around the sacred is, I think, a little bit more clear like water. When, again, historically, and I don't think we're going to dispel with this, and I think both of you are talking about it in terms of the tension of the sacred, that it is no community. Again, Jordan says no community is founded apart from sacrifice. Now we've sort of taken that word and demythologized it and taken it away from blood, but it is all about cost. And so when I think about the advent of the sacred, the tensions I feel in that in our contemporary discourse are we get excited to hear about most real, most reorienting, most transformative, but I think part of the difficulty we have with both pluralism and its daughter secularity, which has been an adaptation to pluralism, but very much, I think Tom Holland is right, very much in the Christian world, is there is a sense that I have an anxiety that we're playing with weighty things without the proper understanding of what that means. I'll give you an example. My wife is teaching. She's a Waldorf teacher, and she's now in her second round. So she takes these kids from first grade to eighth grade all the way through. And this is her second round, so she can see the difference from the kids just 8 years older than them. And one of the things that she noted was when she began, I think in fifth grade, introducing the idea of reverence,
Mhm.
because many of the children had zero religious practice in the homes that they grew up in. And because often death is, if the hamster dies, quick run to the pet store to get another hamster, replace it so the child doesn't, you know, so the child doesn't have to experience a funeral. I remember some of my most meaningful funerals are in the local park where we were burying dead guinea pigs and watching my young children, face what death means for these creatures. And so I guess my question in the use of this, especially the use of this word sacred, is going to be both whether we have an understanding of its roots, which I don't think will be denied, and also an understanding of the fact that I don't know that we have generations that are prepared for it, because one of the things that they don't understand. So then my wife trying to explain what reverence is, and then suddenly you realize I can't put this into words. You need to go to a funeral. You need to go to the tomb of the unknown soldier where, I mean, you can find videos on it. If someone steps over the rope, that soldier has a gun with bullets in it. And suddenly we have a sense of, well, would a soldier shoot someone or do violence at this tomb in order to reinforce the sacred? So it's that end of it that I wonder to what I don't want us to be fast and loose on the roots of this word, because
Yeah.
I think if anyone's reappropriation of the religious is going to have to, I think you said it well, John, it's going to have to go all the way up and it's going to have to go all the way down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me just say,
Oh,
let me just
Jonathan,
say
do you want
one
to add?
little
Yeah,
thing
please,
on that.
please.
I think first of all, I totally agree with you, Paul. I think that, if we look at the sacred events, let's say, or the sacred moments and sacred spaces that have created our time now, I think of Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and I think of the Holocaust. Like those are things that I think of in the sense that they are massive human sacrifices found that have founded the modern, like, let's say, post World War II state, and the entire world order is based on those events. All our narrative, everything we say, is all based on those events. We still, even today, like even Trump being elected is deeply ingrained in these sacred, let's say, stories. And so I completely agree. And that's why I present it as a kind of gray thing, like that the idea that the sacred is returning. It's both, it's like George Floyd was a little eruption of the sacred. It's like here's a fast where everybody is locked into their house, a human sacrifice, and then an ecstatic explosion. It's like, oh, yeah, yeah. Not sure we want that. But the thing is that in some ways, one of the things that is happening is that we're also exhausting the story. It's let's say, and it happens just naturally through time with people dying and generations moving away, and some aspects of the story that were also taboo are people are trying to talk about it in different ways. And so this is demythologization of the stories is also going to happen of that sacred origin. And so we can see attempts at that now. We can kind of see it happening. We can see this poke. And so it's calling for another foundation. Um, and so I agree that there's an aspect of it that is absolutely terrifying. But the problem is that it's going to these things are going to happen. Like there's no like for example, like this weird desire for World War III, like this weird, like, longing and dreaming of nuclear war at this moment, with a mix of fascination and terror that we can see in the eyes of people that keep talking about it. It's like that's a longing for the sacred too. uh it's a longing for something that will just set things right. Like it will make everything clear again, because now everything is muddy and nobody knows where they are and nobody knows what to think and nobody knows. It's like a good war, let's just put everything in place. And so these are all things that are happening, and they're all things that are very frightening. And that's why I keep harping on the fact that I think the way that Jordan presents it, is deeply a Christian way of thinking of it. It's like the cross replaced this with self-sacrifice. It is the sacred, like it is both the ultimate sacred and the disarming of the sacred, right? In the way that René Girard talks about it, but then also I think in a way that Girard misses, because it is still a anyways, there's something else going on in Jesus's cross that is not just a disarming of the sacred. It's a refounding of it in a way, in a deep way. So I think that it's weird, like the only solution to avoiding a sacred event in the big sense is to enact it personally, in a small way, almost like a kind of diffusion mechanism, like where we enact the 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 best aspects of the sacred in our lives and our families and our communities, and that can prevent the need for a new sacred foundation, which will be bloody. Like there's almost no other way for it to happen. Like, so I mean, you could imagine something. I mean, it could be something else. Maybe that's why Elon Musk wants to go to Mars, because he's looking for a sacred event. He's looking for something to refound us, something to give us a new direction, a new purpose. Maybe that's what's all these things are kind of bubbling up at the same time. But I agree with Paul that we cannot forget the what the sacred is and how it manifests itself.
So this is a deep point. I want to respond to it deeply. And if you go back again into the Latin sacer or sacer, was often interchangeable with numinen, with the numinous, and you're both pointing to that deep connection between the sacred and the numinous. And the numinous is simultaneously terrifying and fascinating. I think a better translation would be it's simultaneously horrifying and fascinating.
Yeah.
And then it brings about the confrontation with something mysterious, which is something that is presencing to us, but is also withdrawing beyond our capacity. And people respond to that kind of profound anomalous realization in multiple ways. And they can respond. And yes, they killed Socrates, but there was also, I want to say, yes, they killed Socrates, but there was also Plato, right? And there was the Axial Revolution. There's been dark advents of the sacred, I don't deny it, but there has been powerful positive ones like the Axial Revolution, like the Hellenistic revivals of Stoicism and Epicureanism, and they gave birth to Neoplatonism as a response to the Hellenistic domicide, which was a very bad time for people to be alive. I do agree that I think the two are bound together, but I do think that we're talking about, I like what Paul said. We're talking about, so the affective side of the numinous is awe. Awe is when you're on the horizon of horror, but you're also being drawn in and fascinated. Awe is not a virtue. Awe is an affective state. And the virtue in which you properly respond, because that's what virtue is. Virtue is the power to properly respond, the power to properly respond. The virtue that is the proper response to awe is reverence. I mean, I think Woodruff makes a very good case for that. And I think and I think there's a relationship between reverence and wonder and humility. I think we educate people into reverence, which is the virtue for the proper response to awe. Because what we're worried about is the affective state and the possible emotionally laden and fraught responses people can make to it. That's what I'm hearing you say, right? And so what is missing, I agree, is the cultivation of the virtue of reverence, which is a form of relevance realization, right? And I think that the way you cultivate a virtue is you give, well, Aristotle, you give people the golden mean, you give them the virtual engine. You open them up with wonder to transcendence, but you ground them in their finitude. And this is Plato. You keep the tonos, the creative tension between finitude and transcendence. If people are just driven into their finitude by awe, they fall into despair and they'll be easily manipulatable by tyrants. This is Plato's great argument. But if they experience just the transcendence of awe, they are prone to hubris and inflation. And then you get Nazism and you get, Stalin and you get all of that. But and this was Plato's answer, if people properly cultivate the virtue of reverence and they wander into their transcendence, but they are humble about their finitude and they hold them together, then I think we can best prepare people for what I think we're all agreeing is going to happen, regardless of anything we say or do here. Now, is that something that we can do? And I do think it is something we can do. I do believe, I'm sorry, I do trust the people like Plato and Siddhartha. I do also think Jesus of Nazareth, that people can be taught. Not everybody will be taught, but people can be taught, right? And people can be taught, and and it's not a teaching of theory. You don't teach a virtue by giving people theory. You have to give them some theory. You have to do a lot. And Jonathan, you're right. It has to reach into, I think, the guts of our everyday life. But I think we should also be encouraging artists. We should be encouraging people who are doing we should also be doing stuff that reach wide audience in order to also try and address it at that level too. That's my hope for the philosophical Silk Road. It's designed at these multiple levels of access so people can take it deeply into their personal, individual, and family lives, but it's also designed to speak at the cultural level and challenge some of the cultural narratives that I think block us and lock us so that we will only have a negative response to the advent of the sacred. So I do think there is a profound pedagogical responsibility. Now, I want to be clear. I've given up the engineering idea of this. The profound, right, pedagogical, right, responsibility is, can we educate people, and that requires a transformative education. Can we educate people into virtue of reverence, right, which is bound up with wisdom, which is bound up with knowledge, because all the virtues come together, right, right, such that we can tip the needle towards the more productive, creative, human and life enhancing disclosures of the sacred, and reduce the, I agree, the highly probable negative responses. This is why this project is so urgent. I think I'm deeply I'm deeply agreeing with you. I do want to emphasize that one point about this: a virtue is always between excess and deficit. Like, we can be too loose, but we can be too tight about this too, right? And virtues are always about the golden mean. They're always about dealing with excess and deficit. Right. So we may, I agree, Paul. Loose, we may have a deficit, right? But if we try to be too tight and have too much closure, right? I think, I think a lot of the a lot of the dangerous responses to the sacred have been individuals and groups pursuing what's called premature cognitive closure, trying to lock it all down. I mean, that's an abiding feature of the rise of the Nazis. They're trying to lock everything down, and they're pursuing purity and purity codes. I think purity codes are just as dangerous, right, as looseness.
Yeah, for sure.
And I can point to as many totalitarian evils driven by purity codes as I can to. I agree, Paul, but I'm saying I think it's on both sides. And I think the virtue is about how can we properly find, how can we steer between Scylla and Charybdis and actually be propelled forward by them, like Jason. And I do think that is pedagogically possible. I don't think it's inevitable. I don't think there's any teleology, but I feel called to this. I feel I'm a teacher and I'm a scientist, and I have some degree of influence. And so I feel called to bring all of my expertise as a teacher and as a scientist into the public space that I've cultivated to try and do exactly what I'm proposing.
It strikes me there's a deep connection between the meaning crisis, the the destruction of the liturgies and practices, and with Paul Kingsnorth's speech, you have this conversation that's emerging about civilizational Christianity. We could talk about civilizational religion, where the historical religions tried to balance that they had an understanding that if you're going to have a livable world, that the formation of people, in terms of reverence, in terms of all of these things, understanding, things are too tight. John, to a degree that I understand your story of trauma with Christianity, there's a sense of, we are going to instill our children with holy terror with respect to the rapture, and many of us involved in Christian communities understand we see this played out. I think my parents did a much better job in terms of understanding the balance. But there
And
is,
I see that respectfully and lovingly in both of you, right? I do. I do. And I see it in Bishop Maximus, right? I do. And I think in friendship I have reverence for that. right? And it has been tremendously healing for me with respect to. I feel that I'm something on like a long, dark return, perhaps, to Christianity. That's what might come out of the philosophical Silk
Yeah.
Road. I'm not trying to foreclose on what's going to happen.
But I think that as Jonathan mentioned, that has to fractally scale. You need that in the family, you need that in the town, you need that in the nation, you need it in the civilization. And part of what's happened is a lot of this has gotten out of whack. Not necessarily that it was terribly in whack at any other given period of time, but the process of stewardship of a civilization, of a family, of a church, of a village, that process is always to hold, to keep the full range of the sacred in play. And we have a culture that, I forget who it was, but someone mentioned that they had college students who had never been to a funeral.
I know.
And
Oh my, like, how can you be one of the wisest people in my life said to me, John, never get into a significant relationship with somebody who has not touched grief because they have not developed their humanity. And I have
Mhm.
followed that advice.
yeah, so you have this. So then, and I also like the advent of the sacred. I like this, but I wanted to talk about it
Yep,
because
yep, yeah.
I'm afraid that well, I live in California, so it's sunny and, Californians are optimistic. We have the same medical assistance in dying program statutes as Canada, but Canada, you guys are, many more people in Canada are choosing to end their lives quickly, whereas in
Yeah.
California, well, not so much. But when I look at Californians with respect to the sacred, I think a lot of people think Disneyland. And but then, of course, Hollywood has this weird fascination. On one hand, we have The Walking Dead, okay, back to the zombies, and then we have the Barbie movie, and so American culture is like really out of balance with respect to this, partly because if you're going to understand the sacred, oh, I don't want, and you hear this from Richard Dawkins, and I love what you said, Jonathan, about maybe Elon Musk wants to have a holy moment in terms of the Mars landing. It was fascinating in Richard Dawkins' conversation with Jordan Peterson when Richard Dawkins keeps mentioning the moon landing.
Yeah,
And
I know.
it's
It's
like,
hilarious. So funny.
why that? So, okay, so the moon landing is sacred and Hiroshima is sacred. And I hear people complaining that, okay, so we created a temple out of Auschwitz, but they're bothered by the fact that young people go there and they just kind of like they're having a picnic by a lovely flowing stream. And so we have the advent of the sacred is going to be something which I think should be celebrated, as in a sense Christians are doing, Justin Brierley, the strange reawakening of God. But also there should be a bit of a hushed reverence about this, because when when the sacred comes back to us, I mean, because biblically, and Protestants get this wrong regularly, but there's a whole panoply of Protestant churches that get it right, get it wrong in both directions often. Um, God is both, ultimate terror and the satisfaction of all our desires. And that is all part of this. And so, as the advent of the sacred, yes. And I agree with Jonathan and with you, John, too, as but what I wanted to make sure that we voiced was the whole range of this. And then in terms of the pedagogical mission that I think Awakening from the Meaning Crisis and the Symbolic World and whatever it is happening on my channel, the pedagogical purpose of this is to, of course, present the balanced diet, to present the fact that the holy sometimes is clear water flowing in the city four square that descends from above, but it's also, I know a river, made of blood. And all of these things are always part of the picture. And so in our pedagogy I know that's a tough sell for people because people say, I know the pain, I want the escape, but it's like you never lose it. It's always
But
both
Yeah.
there.
but that's part of that. Part of that is the blinkers put on us by the Enlightenment,
Yes.
right? The idea that reality was tame, right? We confused intelligibility with domestication. We confused intelligibility with domestication. We could have a universal calculus, and we have forgotten the pronounced transformative nature of reality, because reality, like reality does, it has these two sides to it. There's the pressing presence of that which shines in the phenomena, but there's always inseparably bound up with it the withdrawal into the mysterious moreness. Those you can't pull. That's what reality is like, and that's why we do this what seems like this bifurcated thing. When things are confirmed, we think we have something's on we've got reality, but also when we're shocked and surprised, Hiroshima, we think, oh, that's reality. And it's because these are not, right. And what we try to do is we try to cleave the one off. The Buddha talks about this too. People, I want to be free from all the dark stuff and just give me the candy. And you can't do that. That's not how reality works. If reality only confirmed and comforted you, it wouldn't give you what you most need from reality, which is being real, which is it exists in its own right, independent of your egocentric projects and concerns. Not not antagonistic. I'm not saying that. I'm not a Gnostic, right? But I'm saying like what you most need from reality is that it can anchor meaning in life, that it can like I want to be connected to something bigger than myself. I want to be connected to something beyond my egocentric preferences. And what do they mean by bigger? They mean I'm in my dream, and in my dream it seems real. And then I move to the waking world, which is bigger and realness is always a comparative realization. And that waking up is painful. Like you can be in the most sweetest dream, but you know what? Reality can also wake you up from the worst nightmare. It does both. It does both. And you can't pull them apart. That is a fragmentation, a bifurcation of the realness of reality given to us by the Enlightenment. And this is what it's falling apart. One of my most recent papers on why you can't naturalize relevance realization. The paper that Anna Riddell and I have submitted on rationality and relevance realization. The understanding that reality is not just risky, because that means we can calculate it and tame it, but fundamentally ontologically uncertain, ontologically complexifying, ontologically demanding, and that we can't actually ever come up with the view from nowhere picture that tames it all for our egocentric concerns. But this is part of what I mean by the advent of the sacred. That's what I was trying to get at, the beautification and the glorification, a reapprehension. And that word has two meanings, right? I'm playing on both of them. A reapprehension of realness. What our society suffers from, one of the things driving it, is our society is really crap at realness and getting worse at it, and people are starving. But they're not starving in the caloric sense because they're filled like with junk food, but they're starving in the malnutrition sense, that their health is suffering and therefore their resilience. Look what happened in COVID. We saw that the culture has almost no resilience to the significant slapping of reality in our face. Look what's happening at the university. When I started there, there'd be one or two students a year coming into my office and crying. I now get 5 or 6 a week. Like, the resiliency is gone. The resiliency is gone. And you don't get resiliency without reverence to realness. Maturity is about facing up to reality. Listen to the metaphors. They're trying to teach us something really profound.
Hmm. Hmm. It's interesting because, you know, the idea of the sacred as, I mean, we kind of went down this road, so I think it's good to explore it as well. Like this idea that the sacred has a blood aspect to it or has a suffering aspect to it, you know, and the I think for sure childbirth is one of those moments, right? So it's like we know that we are born into the world in pain and screaming and blood. Like this is something that is there at the origin of each of us, you know. And then also if you think of the rituals of initiation rituals, whether it's circumcision or baptism, these are all rituals that are related with a type of engagement with blood or death or, you know, all of this. And it's fascinating to think about that because in some ways, you know, I mean, I do it. Obviously, I do it. Like I love my children, and so you want to make their life easy. Like
Yeah.
you don't want to make their life difficult because you're trying to kind of, you know, you try to pave the way for them, trying to open up doors for them. You want to give them opportunities, uh, but you know, you realize to what extent we're kind of stuck. Like the idea of a Star Trek world, right, where everybody is just basically rational and self-accomplished and everything doesn't seem to be right in terms of what humans actually need. That we need some type of pressure, some type of difficulty, and some contact with a numinous terror in order to give us the right grounding, you know, for us to be able to move forward. And it's difficult, you know. There is an interesting idea that maybe at this point in time we have to be even more deliberate about that. I mean, when I think of the gym bros, you know, I get a sense that that's what they're trying to do. You know, it's like life's easy, make it hard, right? Like, you know, this Jocko Willink like approach to reality. You know, this idea that if you like give yourself challenge, give yourself opposition, right, in order to create these little sacred moments of exertion and exhaustion and success. I don't think it's enough. I mean, I hate. I don't want to knock the gym bros. Like I love the gym bros, but there's something a little. There's something superficial, but it seems like there's a need to make this more deliberate. You know, and I like Martin Shaw and Paul Kingsnorth. By the way, like I just this is in passing, but it's worth mentioning. I watched Paul Kingsnorth First Things speech. I know you posted it, Paul Vaniclay, where Paul basically goes after civilizational Christianity and kind of goes after Jordan a little bit, you know, and Ayaan Hirsi Ali and all these people. And it's weird because it's so weird. Like I totally welcome that. Like I totally welcome what Paul's saying because we absolutely need that. We need someone to say, "Hey folks, this is terrifying. Hey folks, this is hard. Hey folks, this is going into the desert and you know starving yourself and like this is I totally love it. But this is the paradox. The paradox is that it seems to yield a world, right? So the negative aspect, right? This kind of destructive aspect or deconstruct, you know, the saint of Saint John the Baptist saying, you know, basically clear the road, like destroy it all, like just reduce it to rubble, right? That this sacrificial aspect, this baptism, seems to yield a positive world. So I don't know, like I don't know how to. I mean, I have little ideas, but it seems like there's that aspect of it that we have to be aware of. How can we, in a world where everything is easy, create or not create, but participate in the more terrifying aspect of the sacred in a way that is affording, like that way that transforms us, you know?
I always chuckle when Jordan says, go find the hardest thing you can find, the heaviest thing you can find and lift it. And as a pastor, I think these things find you. You
Yeah, yes, they.
seldom have to go looking for them because the ones that you pick up voluntarily, yeah, I get the whole valence about the voluntarily, but the truth is, and this is where I know we started with Advent, we then sort of burrowed down into sacred. I want us to swing back towards Advent because I think, I mean, one of the things that in a Protestant church I learned late and have to try to keep reminding my people because they keep mistaking Advent for Christmas liturgically. Because Advent is a fasting season and Christmas is a feasting season. And of course, in American culture, we sing Christmas songs during Advent. And once Christmas comes, all that Christmas music, which has been playing, and all the decorations that have been in stores suddenly drop off a cliff and are, suddenly when it's December 26th, well, we'll have a little bit of New Year stuff. But then when it's January 2, we're all going to be depressed for the next couple of months while it's still
Yeah,
dark.
we flip the Christmas season.
We completely flip it. And so I think in this sense also, John, I really like what you did with Advent in that this is not the production of a religion. This is not the creation of a religion. This is not the manufacturing of a religion. Advent comes, but always in liturgically in the Christian season of Advent, it's always the coming of Christ in terms of Bethlehem and all of that, but it's also the book of Revelation and the day of the Lord, because
Yeah, but
they're
not just
also
that, Paul. Christmas is terrifying. Christmas, I love, we celebrate Christmas. We don't obviously talk about the massacre of the innocents too much when we celebrate Christmas, but it's part of the story. The child being hunted by the king and the massacre of a generation of children is part of Christmas. Like there is an absolutely like Nagasaki aspect to Christmas. You can't avoid that in these stories. It's just part of the structure of these stories. There has to be a kind of terror. It's just I hate to say it. It's just part of how the stories lay themselves out, And even Saint Nicholas, if you look at the older images of Saint Nicholas, like Saint Nicholas always had a demon with him. He had a demon whipping children, and like these are hard things to reestablish today because I wouldn't want to do it, but I also now understand why it's part of these aspects are part of these stories.
But that gives me something I really want to bring up now that we've turned back to Advent. Um, and again, I think what I'm going to say is all versions of we have to give up this truncated, truncated, domesticated notion of realness, and we have to get that transformation is an undergoing, and therefore, and an undergoing involves suffering, where suffering isn't just pain. I've talked about this for a long time. Suffering is the loss of like a loss of agentic control. You can't make it. You don't just passively wait. You have to participate. The verb is you participate, right? You participate, you cultivate, right? Participation. But this goes towards, I think part of the advent of the sacred is a recovery of the realness within the three transcendentals. Okay, that's highfalutin language, and I'm trying not to use that very much anymore, right? But this is the idea that that there's these sort of three dimensions through which reality discloses itself: the true, the good, and the beautiful. I like the way D.C. Schindler, David, talks about it. The primacy of beauty, the centrality of goodness, and the ultimacy of truth. They're all superlatives, but they're superlatives in their own dimension, which I think is a beautiful way of putting it. And then that dimensionality makes you realize there is that within which the three dimensions are found, in which the convertibles all interpenetrate each other. And that, of course, is the one, right? And it is not. And I'm not introducing anything that isn't found clearly within the Cappadocian Fathers. I just had a great conversation with James Fuller, by the way. Now, what we've done is think about, and I did a course on the primacy of beauty for the Peterson Academy, which is going to be coming out soon. And I think about Hahn's notion about the reduction of beauty to the smooth. We've reduced beauty to the smooth, the comfortable, the easily gratifying, and we therefore, our response to Eros, and that it's all perverted, and that's his point, the agony of Eros, is a pornographic relationship. But if you think about Rilke, he says, beauty is an angel that could kill you, but decides not to.
I love that. That's a great idea.
Right. And if you go back to Plato, beauty is glorious, but it is not fun. Right. Beauty launches the Trojan War.
Yeah.
Right. Beauty is a profound disclosure of realness, but we have lost beauty and we don't have a reverential attitude towards beauty. In a similar way, we have to understand that there is moral goodness, but in the transcendentals, the moral goodness points to ontological goodness, ontology having to do with the structure of being. Look, People like reality not be they like reality because it's real. like let me do it one more time. I ask my students, how many of you are in deeply satisfying romantic relationships, our greatest idol replacement and surrogacy for God? How many of you would want to know if your partner was cheating on you and it would mean the absolute destruction of the relationship? And almost all of them put up their hand. And I ask them why, because it's not real, right? There's a realness, and that's not a moral realness. That's not sorry, that's not a moral goodness. That's not an aesthetic, right? It's not even epistemic. It's just we want realness for its own sake. We want to be connect. That's what I think meaning in life is about. We want to be connected to something bigger because we want to be connected to reality for its own sake. Nishitani defines religion as the real self-realization of reality, which I think is exactly what I'm trying to talk about here. And I think part of the advent of the sacred, and I see this happening, this is what I was trying to convey with beautiful and glorious, is a re-understanding of beauty as the disclosure of the depths of realness. Appearances not distracting or distorting, but disclosing. Moral goodness as participating in ontological goodness, the very goodness of being that you, Jonathan, and Jordan and I were talking about, and that one of the great claims of Genesis is that reality is just good, right? God pronounces it good before there's any moral beings. Hear that. God pronounces it good before there are any moral beings. It's just good. That's ontological good. And the recovery of truth as like the etymological word trothing, betrothal, as a deep connectedness, a reciprocal opening, platonic anagogy, all these different ways of recovering the transcendentals, and then through them, like through my glasses, seeing the one behind them, or the good, or the Tao. And I'm also happy to say God behind the transcendentals. I think like we've lost the realness in truth, goodness, and beauty, and we have reduced them all to things that we think we can domesticate with our mechanical methods and manipulations.
And we imagine that they only exist in our experience of them.
That's the fact value dichotomy, and
Yeah.
that is absolutely collapsing.
Yeah. Well, and it also strikes me as interesting, of course, Dostoevsky's Notes from the Underground, where he makes the observation that if you give, and the Matrix makes the same observation, that if you give people a world that many people say they want, I do want all the satisfaction and none of the struggle, that this is a world that we destroy because
Yes.
it is not real. And we have a sense of that. Yet at the same time, part of the narrative of, let's say, the Christian story is you arrive at the new Jerusalem, the new heavens and the new earth. And so, one of the things that all the biblical images are always evocative. I don't think they're always evocative, but they always leave us sort of wanting more, but somehow unable to flesh out. In other words, I think I was just listening to some James Davidson Hunter, and I've started his book where he's talking about different different senses of the Enlightenment, because the French Revolution and the American Revolution weren't the same, and so in the English, I mean, it's all
Yep.
as we're dealing with the Enlightenment, as we're burrowing down into it, we have to sort of begin to distinguish different expressions of it. But we again we bought into this idea that this was something that we could manufacture, and we convinced each other that the sacrifices necessary for this were not only necessary but an improvement over the old sacrifices we used to make. And I think we're getting to the point now where we're realizing some of those bargains weren't as real or as true as we thought they would be.
Yeah, I think the Promethean spirit, um, you know, I mean, what you just gave, Paul, to my ears was a fantastic Orwellian critique of utopias.
Yeah.
Utopia is everything we're talking about on speed. So we can cleave away all the yuckiness and we can manufacture all the wonderfulness, and it will be wonderful and wonderful and wonderful. And therefore, we can kill millions of people. It starts in the Reign of Terror, right? We can kill millions of people because it's justified, because we will eradicate suffering. So that how, I mean, if you honestly believed that your utopia will eradicate all suffering and bring nothing but unending pleasure and happiness, then that justifies any suffering you inflict right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so this is why again, on my tombstone, right? Neither nostalgia nor utopia. Right.
Now, so John, my question then is, and please don't, I think we have enough of a relationship now that that I'm not trying to coerce you or twist your arm or anything. It's a
I
good
know.
faith, honest question.
Yeah.
Can we generate the kind of desire appropriate for the optimism of the advent of the sacred without a vision of the city four square descending from above? If you go all the way to Paul Kingsnorth talk, and someone, of course, addresses him with the question, the inevitable question from his talk. I don't know if you've listened to it yet, John, or not.
No, I haven't had a chance to.
You'll want to listen to it. But again, the Bible ends in a city, and then Paul Kingsnorth says, yes, but it descends from above, and so I mean
by the way, he's right and he's wrong, because the city descends from above and all the kings of all the nations offer their glory to the city. And so that it's a top down and bottom up process. You can see this, we talk about emanation and emergence. That's the city in the heavenly Jerusalem is described as completely top down and bottom up. So it's not as simple as just saying, well, it just comes from God. It's like, no, it comes from God, and all the kings offer up their best to it, and so it's being built also from below. But it's funny that I think that's why the city on the hill is right. It's eschatological, and it's just not a historical thing. It's not something. It's a new heaven and a new earth. It's not this world, and that's the point. If you make it this world, then seriously, I mean, we all know it's like you after 2 weeks of vacations, you're ready to go back. It's like, that's it. I like going on vacation, but at some point I'm done. I'm done with vacation. It's like we need a little bit of friction here. We need a little bit of yeah. So I think that the idea of the eschatological vision is the way to go. But sorry, I interrupted your question there, Paul.
Well, and so then the question then I have is how. I don't know, and this goes back. I feel so immensely grateful for the privilege that I've had conversing with you two over the last 5 years. And in some ways, I see how our conversations have progressed, but how we're also continuing to work on where we began working in many ways. Yeah. And so I still think part of what happens in, I don't know if we want to say two worlds mythology, but the eschatological has to be there. I just read, because Peterson's been talking about Iliad, I just read the
Sacred and the Profane.
The Sacred and the Profane.
Good book.
It is a good book. It is a good book. And of course, in some ways, Charles Taylor gets the realization of the different times. You have, so you need an eschatological vision as part of the overall picture, just like you need the blood and not just clear water. And so I guess my question then is, how does that fit in? Because basically what many of the Enlightenments did was just pretty much cut it off and say, we cannot talk we cannot have an eschatology apart from an immanentized eschatology that becomes utopia.
I want to challenge you on that.
Yeah, good. Please. That's why we're talking.
Yep. And so I think the Enlightenment thought it was doing that. And what the Enlightenment did was just replace the two worlds mythology with a whole bunch of dichotomies. And a dichotomy is not a conceptual distinction that's pragmatically useful. A dichotomy is a deep ontological division. There is the subjective world of value. There's the objective world of fact. There is the mind. There's the body. There is science. There's religion. There's theory and data. I don't think it went away in the Enlightenment. I think it went underground and went unconscious.
Hmm.
And it gives us what, by the way, strongly recommend this book by Frank Gleitzer and my good friend Evan Thompson, The Blind Spot. It put us into we create the worldview from which we do science is not the worldview of science, right? And that is a profound performative contradiction. That's what all those dichotomies do. They put you into the blind spot, just a whole system of performative contradictions. I don't think the Enlightenment cut it off. I think the Enlightenment internalized it in an unconscious and unhealthy way as all of these dichotomies that literally blind us to reality in a profound way. Now, there was obviously a lot of value to the Enlightenment. I believe in science. I'm a scientist. I don't no nostalgia. I don't want to go back and there not be science. I'm glad there was the American Revolution. I'm glad America's in the world for all of the ways in which it seems to be descending into some sort of very, very, 1968 horror movie or something. Not even very well acted, because both of the main characters are not good actors. For all of that, I think the United States is it has often called itself a city on the hill. In important ways. So I want to be clear
So
what I'm
those
doing.
were the Reformed Puritans, but anyway, go on.
but the language has been used by presidents,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
I don't think I'm being
Ronald Reagan. Yep.
Yep, right, very much. And so I do think the Enlightenment thought it was doing what you said, but I don't think it was actually doing what it said. I think it was doing it propositionally without realizing at the level of like the non-propositional, it was actually internalizing them, but internalizing them as profound performative contradictions, these disastrous dichotomies. And I think that to my mind speaks that you can't actually get rid of the sacred. You can only smuggle it in some way or other. And part of what I hope by talking about the advent of the sacred is to replace an unconscious, often autodidactic, fragmentary, and maladaptive response to the sacred to an explicit, dialogical, and hopefully virtuous response to the sacred. So the reason I don't like that picture, Paul, is because I've become critical of it, is because
Which picture?
the picture that the Enlightenment tries to lop it
Okay.
all off,
Okay.
right? Because it's all of that's what it does is it keeps all the dichotomies and it does a lot of weird inversions and confuses that with just lopping it off. And part of what it does, right, is I'm worried that picture also fits into the religion versus science fable, which I think has been a disastrous fable for us. And the romantics are actually they're on the they're part of that fable too. They're fabulous in the pejorative sense of the word. They just invert it, right? Yes, it is a conflict, and but right, and
But
we'll give you
I think Paul was also trying to say that it's not that just that they lob it off, it's that they're trying to make it happen. So they're trying to take the heavenly Jerusalem and make it an actual immanentize it, right? Like like people saying like, oh, we don't believe in God, we're going to make a God. Like we're going to make a God with AI. Like that's the type of attitude that
I
the
get
modern
that,
world seems to have.
but that's a performative contradiction. That utopias make no sense if you believe in the
Of course, we agree with you.
Yeah.
fact value distinction. They make no
Right.
sense.
My question though, John, for your project is the lift you want to get from the advent of the sacred. I hear the optimism, I hear the eschatology in that phrase.
Yes.
And I wonder if, because I think the power from that, just from a pastoral perspective, in terms of working with regular people in the pews, the power they get from that is for them the New Jerusalem. The power in a Christian funeral is my beloved is now with Christ and await a resurrection. That is a power in the narrative that gives a civilization a courage and an optimism to face the bottom end of the of the of the of the stack of the sacred. And
I
so,
like
in
that.
terms of the process and in terms of the project, my question is, where do you get the energy so that the crush of the bottom end can be faced and not lose the glory of the top of the stack?
So I'm not quite sure what the question is. So let me ask you a question back. Are you saying uh, I, I'm taking you to, I'm going to believe that you're not saying that other religions and other traditions don't have deep responses
No,
to
no,
funerals.
no. I'm not saying that.
A funeral is a human universal, like
Right,
music.
right, right.
Okay.
I only really know the Christian tradition, so
Right.
that's what I speak
I
from.
just want to make sure, right?
Yeah.
And so, I mean, and many of these traditions, right, have different, I'll use your language. It's not quite right. It's a bit culturally anachronistic, but they have eschatological visions. There's moksha, there's nirvana, right? There's becoming one with the Tao. Um, and then I want to say that's where the power comes from. Like when people when they have a virtuous virtuosity in Taoism, it's called te, right? Right. When they have that virtuous virtuosity, like the problem with asceticism, and the reason I'm worried about the gym bros is that you can get one version of that is I'm going to harden myself against reality. And the
Yeah.
Buddha rejected asceticism because that hardening doesn't work. And the paradox is, and this is what Taoism argues, is you have to become really soft. You have to be, but that doesn't mean limp and weak. It means soft like flowing water, which is one of the most powerful forces in the universe. And I think, um, I, I, I think if I understand you correctly, uh, the city of God, the city on the hill, moksha, nirvana, uh, right, are all what I would call the imaginal. I think they are images we shouldn't look at but through which we should look in a way that reality can disclose its awe-filledness, and I'm playing with that word, while also still calling us, the stories also give us exemplars of how to cultivate the virtue of reverence. If you're asking me, do I think narratives are essential to this process? I do. But you want to say something more. So I'm not quite getting you, I think.
I don't. There's a. We talked about the sacred, and the sacred has this in this world. The sacred has this balance, and practically people. I mean, why should someone celebrate the advent of the sacred and welcome it? So again, during the Advent, the Christian season of Advent, even though it's a fasting season, and as
Oh,
Jonathan said, Christmas is super complex in this world for Christians because I also believe that one of the things that we see in the Gospels is one of the things I hear Jesus saying regularly is, I'm pointing you to the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of God, but this world right here and right now isn't really terribly capable of holding all of it. It's too small. It's sort of like hot air holds more water than cold air. And this world is too cold, and the amount of glory and the amount of power and the amount of blessing that I dearly want to give you cannot be finally held by this world. And so basically my observation in that is the way that Christianity works for civilizations in terms of, I mean, Christianity has allowed people to not only survive but flourish through tremendous sufferings over the course of time. And again, I'm not doing a comparative with other religions because I just simply don't know. So
sure.
my
Well,
point isn't the
I'll play in your
comparative.
ballpark. I'll play in your ballpark.
Okay. So the question is, there's an energy, there's an energy that Christians throughout time have received from
Ah,
eschatology that I think is essential to the
okay.
system.
Yeah, I want to. So there is now because I'm playing in your ballpark, I want you to take the words I'm using in that
Yep.
spirit. There's an eschatological energy to the advent of the sacred, which is exactly that the advent of the sacred is not our individual or conceptual responses. It is the response of ultimate reality to the meaning crisis.
But there's also, I think, one of the
Well,
things you're
wait,
pointing
let
to,
me
Paul.
say
Oh, sorry, go
one
ahead.
more thing, and that is deeply, deeply important to people. People are starving, right? Scarcity mentality, deeply starving, and when we're in scarcity mentality, we're rigid, we're short term, we're impulsive, we're irrational, we're egocentric. And people are seeing that is ripping the world apart. People want release from that. The energy is, do you want release from that? And do you want religio? Do you want the abundant life? Jesus also promised the abundant life, and he also promised that people would do even greater than he did. I'm quoting the Bible. I'm not saying something new agey, right? And so I think that the energy that I'm seeing in all these communities is people are energized by this precisely because it is a salvation, right? It is a healing of the meaning crisis, and it is also spiritual food that is growing them up in ways that they could not have done before. Now, sorry for Jonathan, but I wanted to finish that point.
No, I think what I was trying to point out in terms of what I think, Paul, I don't know if I'm wrong. I think one of the things you're presenting is that the vision, let's say the vision of the heavenly Jerusalem, for example, it's a cosmic vision.
Yes.
It's not an individual
No.
vision, although the individual plays a part in it. It's a vision of an entire world. So it, it has everything of a world. It has, it has the natural element, the civilizational element. It has the participation of all people, and it's something which in some ways is not in this world. It's in the next world. It's in the new heaven and the new earth. It calls us towards itself, right? And we like call for it, right? This whole idea of the calling for Lord Jesus, right at the end of the book of Revelation too, like this image of we're calling for this to come. We also understand that it's not. When I say this, uh, it is a vision of what is coming or what is possible or what the next world or the best world it can afford us, and it's also a cohesive vision that is it's not can I say this, like it's a it's it doesn't it doesn't just remain at the level of the individual or even at the level of a community or at the level of a like I don't want to pick on like I don't want to pick on Rafe particularly. I like Rafe and I love what he's doing, let's say, and like say the practices that they're doing. They 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 don't I don't think they scale. They don't encompass a vision of a of how it is that this relates to the city and how does this relate to us coming together? How does it relate to
Yeah.
our the hierarchical relationship between the city and the tree and the water and all of these images and the
But,
sacrifice that is there at the middle of the image. That is, I mean, I think that's what, because when I talk about the advent of the sacred, you know, I'm talking also about civilizational things. I'm talking about something like the Civil War in America is a sacred event for the identity of America, that all these kind of terrifying things. So the question is, how do we answer that? Like, what possible stance can we have, or what vision can we keep in the imaginal space in order to help us face the aspects of what's coming or what's happening or what might what's coming over the hill,
but
that has all these levels in it.
yeah, but it's there. That's what and I started by talking about a new world is coming. A
Mm-hmm.
new world is being born here, We talked about, right? We have a leveled ontology with participation, right? And that affords strong transcendence, not just psychological improvement. It has ontological, right? It has existential import to it. It gives you new truths that are otherwise inaccessible. Listen to the title of a book by a scientist, Eric Hole, "The World Behind the World."
Hmm.
This is what I'm talking about. The Advent is a whole new way in which the world is worlding, and
Hmm.
the world isn't a thing, right? And this is, goes back, Jonathan. I'm alluding to Heidegger here, of course, but this is now not just in the corners of Heideggerian philosophy, like the world behind the world, or putting us back into the equation, right? And all these books, because what's happening is there is the and there is a new world that is being born right now, and many people are attracted and energized by this, and it's turning into real scientific work. And this is energizing. Though, like I said, the work of Michael Levin. I get what I get. I do think that Rafe is moving constantly towards a much more encompassing relationship for the disclosure of the world.
And I'm
But
sorry, I hate to pick on that, not pick or like take him as an example,
no, no,
just
no, no, no.
something came to mind because we mentioned it
What I think is
before.
he's responsive of it. And
Yeah.
when I talk to these groups, there is the shifting, the ones that aren't going culty and creepy and weird, right? When I talk to these groups, right, and there's a lot that aren't going culty and
Yeah,
creepy
yeah.
and
No, I
weird,
believe you.
right? Um, there is this movement towards, again, how I talked about this. We're making a space so a new worlding of the world can happen. That's part of the advent of the sacred. And people, this is what is energizing them, Paul. They want to live in that world.
Yeah. Well,
That's what
and
I was
so
trying to get at.
so I'm hearing this, and again, as Jonathan said, I mean, I hate that I sort of sometimes feel it's two on one in these, and but John, you're a pretty potent guy, so you can handle us. But when I hear you say something like a new world is being born right now, I don't quite know the register in which to hear that. I mean, I'm sure some people will hear it as utopian, but I also understand that, part of the reason the city on the hill language happened, and if you look at, let's say, the roots of something like New Haven, Connecticut, something of what the Puritans were doing wasn't that far away from what Constantine was doing with the founding of Constantinople and everything that Eusebius writes with respect to that. So, and so part of what, you know, Christianity has long I mean, the part of Christian doctrine that is the least developed is, of course, the eschatological.
And
And
I
Protestants
think for
sort of,
good reason. I think that's good. I
yeah,
think
no,
that's I think the sacred is at work in that.
right. But and when I hear you say that, part of me wonders if I'm also hearing something of, and no, please don't take this as an insult because it's not meant in any way. And it's simply a factor of our Christian civilization that none of us in many ways can escape. That there is something of the immanentized eschatological and an optimism in there. And so, say Mary Harrington, who is skeptical about progress, let's say. So when I hear you say it, part of me is I'm just trying to get my head around what register should I hear this in? Because I know on your tombstone, you're disavowing utopianism. And on one hand, we all need optimism in terms of the
Mhm.
projects with which we participate in our lives and our callings that move us forward. So when you say something, a new world is being born right now, every politician says that, and even those who lose elections. And that then again sort of brings me back around. What I love about the advent of the sacred is that both of these sort of have a back and forth effect to it, because every time you get to Advent, I think naturally in our post-Protestant age, we sort of hear progress. And then we get to sacred, and it's going to be rebalancing us. Because remember, this world always has both ends of the sacred, and we go back and forth. So when you say a new world is being born right now, I don't know the valence in which to hear it.
What I mean by that is like the world that we thought was the world, the domesticated world of all the disastrous dichotomies is falling away, like the scales falling away from Paul's eyes. And there's a new way of seeing. And in that new way of seeing, there's a new way of being in which transcendence, I call it strong transcendence, not just psychological improvement, but it has epistemological and ontological depth to it, is now scientifically plausible. Think about that. Think about the possibility of that, that we can talk deeply about this in a way that reaches to the depths of what people are often hungering for in religion without buying into the dichotomy between religion and science. That is possible. Now, I'm not arguing for scientism. Scientism is part of the Enlightenment picture I'm rejecting.
Yep,
I'm arguing for what you see in, and I think hopefully we're exapting Maximus or Dionysius or Thomas Aquinas, which is no, you better not keep these two apart because that's disastrous. That's disastrous. And so I'm trying to play in the Christian ballpark, right? There has been this continual recognition in the Christian traditions that if you keep these things separated from each other, that is a hole through which evil walks, and you have to keep them bound. This is what I'm talking about. This is the register, that there is a world in which the scales on our eyes of all the dichotomies, right, that straitjacket us, is falling away, and in which strong transcendence is possible. And so that there is a way individually and collectively, and even at the level of a civilization, we can participate in a response to the Enlightenment. We can wake up. We can grow up. I'm sorry, I find that deeply personally motivating, and I know a lot of people do. So I don't know if I'm addressing your question, but that's what it. And I keep using the biblical language because I'm trying to, and I don't think that language is utopic. When the scales fall away from Paul's eyes, he doesn't propose, he doesn't say let's build Jerusalem on the hill like Blake, which is a little bit worrying. It's a great poem, Jerusalem, but it's a little bit until we've built Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land. I don't know if you should be doing that. That's probably not a good idea, right? But right, although I love
a lot of
that.
people love that song.
I love that. That poem is one of my favorite. And and the thing is, if you give yourself over to the poem, you feel the triumph, but that triumph is dangerous, and that we've been talking about that. So when I say no utopia, I don't mean no vision. Without a vision, the people perish. When I say nostalgia, I don't mean no tradition. I'm arguing for in the cognitive science of religion, and I'm arguing for it a little bit in the cognitive science of ritual. We need tradition. We need credible role models that we find trustworthy of wisdom, because that is actually predictive, by the way, of whether or not you're religious. All the Enlightenment fables that people are religious because they're sloppy thinkers, they're intuitive, and if they become more analytic, they're right, then they become atheistic, and they only turn to religion when they're impoverished. Those are scientific proposals, they're hypotheses. Guess what? When atheist researchers went out and looked at them, they've all been disconfirmed. What makes people religious or not religious are the credible individuals that they're living with. So if the people you look up to that you find, they demonstrate credibility enhancing displays, that's the technical term. If they're theists, you're a theist. If they're atheist, you'll be an atheist, right? Now, obviously there's individuals that break away from that, but that tradition, I'm not saying no tradition. I'm not saying no vision. This is how it's different from what I was saying before. But traditions have to live. Jonathan said it. We can exhaust them. They need to be respirated, right? And that's what I think is happening. And that's what I'm trying to talk about.
It's 12. Sadly, I need to go. I think it's a great place to finish, by the way.
Yeah.
So I have to leave. But Paul, thanks for hosting this as usual.
Well, thank you both. And I will send you the recordings, and you can do with them as you please.
I'll post it on my channel. I think this was wonderful. Thank you to both of you. This was really wonderful. And And not to trivialize this, but hopefully to appropriately situate it. This was kind of an extended advertisement for the Philosophical Silk Road, which I really appreciated. So thank you for that.
There you go. There you go. All right, gentlemen. Have a great day.
All right, you
Take
too.
care, my
Bye-bye.
friends.
All right. Bye-bye.